Some of the hardest problems in the world exist far above the planet. Our job? To launch the smartest solutions, to protect our satellites, clean up our clutter, to propel breakthroughs in propulsion, to learn more about our place in the universe, to outpace emerging threats. Every day, the Aerospace Corporation uses the latest technologies to ensure our nation's safety and leadership in space.
Hi, and welcome to the Space Policy Show. I'm your host, Rebecca Rose. As always, you can find us on Twitter using hashtag the Space Policy Show, and you can engage with our experts on Vimeo using the chat box. We would also like it if you would sign up for our latest news and alerts at aerospace.org/policy. Today's episode is on force design, lessons from the Marine Corps. Today, Aerospace's Russell Rumbaugh talks to Jonathan Wong from RAND to discuss the concept of force design as a way to shape the future of the U.S. Space Force and reflect on lessons learned from the Marine Corps experience. Russell Rumbaugh is a systems director for Aerospace's Center for Space Policy and Strategy, where he conducts research on how institutional defense policy affects U.S. operations in space. Jonathan Wong is a policy researcher at the RAND Corporation. He focuses on the role of new technologies and concepts in shaping militaries, and contributes to other force development research in logistics, manpower, intelligence, and strategy. Welcome, and over to Russell to get us started.
Thanks, Rebecca. And thanks, John, for being here.
Thanks for having me, Russell. It's good to see you again after many years of since we last, I think, first met in Washington, D.C. when I was still a graduate student. So good to see you.
And what John is driving home is he's on today because of common interests he and I have that have nothing to do with space. I'm a little embarrassed to be doing a space policy show with a non-space expert, but I think John's going to help us get at a really interesting dynamic going on with Space Force and in the space enterprise that we could use a little non-space perspective on. And what we're here to discuss today is force design. General Raymond has said from the get-go that Space Force is going to be very innovative. It's going to be light and lean. It's going to do things differently. It's going to be the envy of the other services. It's going to live up to being the first military service of the 21st century. One of the ways they're trying to do that is by leveraging what's called force design, or what they've come around to calling force design. Force design is a relatively new word, though, and one we're trying to explore. Space Force is fully committed to it. They've now stood up, actually, a new organization, Space Warfighting Analysis Center, still based in Colorado Springs, but tied very closely with both the Pentagon staff of the Space Force, as well as all of the other field commands as well, trying to get at this new kind of service. What then is force design is what we're going to explore today. And one of the ways we're going to explore it is not by talking about space, but by talking about the other big example of force design we have in contemporary DoD. And that is coming from the Marine Corps. John's on with us because he is both a scholar about organizational design, about bureaucratic politics, about all of how things work, but he also is both an ex-Marine, and as you know, we have to have Marines to talk about Marines, and also does research looking at both the Marines and the Army, and so has a great perspective on how this new concept is promulgating through the other services. And hopefully with these lessons, we can then turn it and learn a little bit more about how Space Force is going to develop for the next few years. So John, coming from RAND, I'm also proud to have two think tanks on. Can we plunge into it, John? What is this force design term? Where did it come from, and why all of a sudden are we using it?
Well, thanks, Russell. And, I was pondering this question that you posed to me earlier when we first talked about getting together and talking about force development, force design, force employment, all these words, and what do they all mean? And I'm actually a little embarrassed to find out in the last couple days, thanks to some of my colleagues at RAND, that force design isn't actually a new term. It's actually quite doctrinal. There's actually some history behind it. And I guess the best way to explain what force design is to contrast it with some of the other terms that you might hear. Force employment is the use of the forces that we have today. between zero. I guess the planning construct that the Pentagon thinks about is what you're going to do with that force between now and 3 years from now. Contrast that with force development, which is basically taking the forces that you have to, the force structure, the material solutions that you have, the weapon systems that you have, and maybe tweaking it around and doing something different with it. And that's in about the 5 to 7-ish year time frame. And force design is the most extreme version of that. That's when I wouldn't say like where you get to do a clean sheet design where you wipe the whiteboard clean, but as closest to it as you can in the DoD. And that is the time frame about 5 to 15 years where planners really get to think about how new technologies might enable the force to do something different, or different demands on the force, different missions, different roles might alter the way the force is constructed from a personnel standpoint, the force structure, as well as the equipment, the technology that might be used. And so I think what really struck me is that the reason why you and I have been hearing this term force design more often now is because in previous iterations, at least for the Marine Corps, for the Navy, for the Army, for the Air Force, there have been attempts at force development where they get to tweak things around. And I think where you hear force design, both for the Space Force and for the Marine Corps, is because they're trying to do something a little bit more extreme than that. For the Space Force, starting fresh because that's where they're at right now, and for the Marine Corps, trying to make a more drastic move than I think some of the other services have been making so far. So I think that's where I was a little embarrassed to find out that is where the term actually comes from. It comes from doctrine. There's a Joint Chief of Staff instruction buried somewhere that talks about it. But I think the reason why we hear about it a lot is because force design is very rarely pursued by the DoD and by the services.
Thanks, John. I knew we had made the right choice bringing on a diligent RAND researcher who would give us absolutely the by the book answer, going back no matter how long it took. Thanks for living up to everything RAND's supposed to be. We absolutely can brag about FFRDCs throughout the show. Although I got to push back a little bit because it's been interesting watching Space Force explore the term. And as you know, as a scholar of organizations, oh man, clean sheet is so hard to get. And the closest approximation in the space world before the use of the term force design was architecture. Absolutely right that longer term time horizon has been so important. But also what's so important to space is because it's such a highly engineered domain, getting all of the various pieces to interlock well, building the interfaces so they do, has long been one of the tough goals. And so space has long thrown around the term architecture, a term you don't hear in the other services. My favorite way about this is the Navy has architects. They're people who make sure the parts of the ship work together, like much closer to build you a house kind of architect. But it's always had special meaning in the Space Force. And so that has now been moved into force design, not just on a time scale, but on an integrating level, trying to make all of these disparate pieces fit together, which, as you alluded to, is something the Marines are doing differently. So why does the term work for the Commandant? Why did he go to this term? I mean, I know, as you said, because the Commandant's a good doctrinal thinker and you guys have provided the doctrinal terms, but why did he need to use the term? Why couldn't he just said, my new force structure, my new organization? Why did he end up using force design?
That's a really great question, Russell. And I think it actually I think there's something to be said about the different terms that you just introduced, architecture versus force design. And I think that what I think are the similar motivations behind it. For the Space Force, it definitely makes sense to me to use, for me to see the term architecture being used. It's a very engineer-centric force in a kind of a cultural sense. Everything that things that I read and hear about when I read about the Space Force, I hear that term being introduced. I hear other engineering terms being introduced. I even read something not too long ago about proclaiming that the Space Force was going to be a digitally engineered force, harkening back somewhat to, I think, to Dr. Will Roper's efforts to introduce more digital engineering in the Department of the Air Force as a whole. For the Marine Corps, even though it's a different term, I think the motivation is the same.
He was pursuing the digital. I mean, as much as he was willing to give Will Roper credit, the Space Force has been trying to be original and new themselves. But yes, I'm sorry, I shouldn't interrupt.
Absolutely. No worries. For General Berger and the Marine Corps, I think the motivation is the same. It's a signal. It's a cultural signal. And I think to really appreciate and understand why he chose the word force design instead of speaking in more plainly, I think goes back to maybe the last 8 to 10 years in the Marine Corps. And I think back, this is around the time that I was actually leaving the service. And as I was leaving, as a young captain, I could see the Marine Corps thinking a lot about returning to its amphibious roots. That's all senior leaders were saying. We're done with Iraq. We're done with Afghanistan. And we're going to go back to our amphibious roots. And they were launching all these exercises to do the things that they had done before. And within, I think, 2 or 3 years, there's some great articles that the Center for New American Security where they document this. Within 2 or 3 years, they realized that wasn't going to cut it. Not only was that not, previous approaches to amphibious operations wasn't going to cut it, they were getting signaled from on high that their efforts to reset themselves as what they were before Iraq and Afghanistan were not going to be sufficient. I think back to Secretary of Defense Bob Gates. He gave a speech, I think around 2011, 2012 or so at the Marine Memorial Club in San Francisco, of all places, where he questioned the Marine Corps' role in the Department of Defense. He questioned its role. He saw it as a second land army. And that really, I think, lit the fire underneath Marine Corps leaders to really go and try to do something different. And they actually iterated once before, mid to 2010s or so, where they thought about themselves as a crisis response force, as a middleweight force. I kept hearing these terms from their leaders. I think even at some point I was chatting with a friend of mine who's a Pentagon staffer. He was a Marine. And I think a lot of them had this PowerPoint deck, this PowerPoint slide that they all kept in their cargo pockets that they would whip out anytime someone wanted to ask them about the Marine Corps' crisis response capabilities. And so they did all that. They stood up these ad hoc units, and that wasn't enough. And so this is around, I'd say, 2017 or so, 2018. At the end of the previous commandant, General Neller's term, and the beginning of General Berger's term, where they realized that wasn't going to be enough. They needed to signal that they're going to do something more drastic. And although they used, I think, a doctrinal term, force design, they did it and unveiled it in a way that was very much a signal. I think just as the Space Force uses the term architecture as a signal.
I am super excited where you ended up there. I was worried you were going to tell us that Marines are basically an engineering culture, and that didn't seem to jive with my experience. But now I see where you're going. But you've also embarrassed me a little bit. I was sure to use the Chief of Space Operations name, General Raymond, but I hadn't used General Berger's name yet. This is, after all, the Space Policy Show. Maybe we should take a moment and talk about what is General Berger's force design. What does he mean by using this somewhat radical term?
Sure, and let me try. And Russell, you're gonna please interrupt me when I get too deep into the jargon, particularly Marine jargon. I am very conscious as a former Marine that that is a trait that I cannot seem to shake off, and that no matter how objective I try to get as a RAND analyst, I end up reverting at times back to my Marine self. So please, give me the hook if nothing's making sense.
That's
but
the
to answer your,
we have from bringing a Marine onto the Space Policy Show, this will be a successful episode.
Well, I will try not to eat any crayons or anything like that. But for General Berger, what his vision is, and the really cool part about all this is it's so publicly, he puts it out so public in so many different ways. It is about countering China. It is about countering China, not through amphibious assaults and maneuver forces and ground combat directly, but emphasizing the Marine Corps' ability to use long-range precision fires, ground-based long-range precision fires, adding to the kill chain with sensors and other contributions to C4ISR, and having a small presence distributed throughout the region. And I think that's the kind of most basic characterization of where the Marine Corps wants to go under General Berger. And you could definitely argue that in terms of force design, it might be something that's a little too focused on one thing, and that's definitely a criticism that others have leveled against this particular force design. And I think it remains to be seen how much they're going to continue to evolve it. One thing I got to add here is that everything that you read about Force Design 2030, which is what General Berger calls this kind of incarnation of the Marine Corps, every time he writes about it as an initiative where we're going to experiment and continue to iterate. And I'm really interested to see how much more iteration the organization is going to be able to sustain bureaucratically. And I'd be interested to see how the Space Force tackles as well as a new force that doesn't have the same inertia that the Marine Corps is not weighed down by, but has to contend with.
John, you bring up a lot of really interesting parallels there. I'd say the first one to concentrate on is this China focus. For the space, we always have to also add in Russia, who's been a developed space nation throughout the Cold War, but still, it is China that has is more consciously modernizing to make space part of their entire way of warfare. And for the Space Force, this gets expressed as space as a warfighting domain. And without a doubt, one of the purposes of force design is, again, to take all these disparate systems, the GPS satellites, the satellite communication satellites, the missile warning satellites, and turn them into a single organization better designed for fighting a war, potentially even in space, something that can be commanded and controlled. The Marines, of course, have thought they're a warfighting organization for a very long time. Can you tell us a little more what that looks like, the break between crisis operations or Iraq and Afghanistan or their amphibious roots and this new Force Design 2030 look?
Sure. I think the biggest thing, if they actually accomplished this and laid this force out and employed it as they envision it today, I think the most noticeable thing that you see is that it's going to be really small in terms of unit size. So historically, when I think back to the last time the Marine Corps was really big in the Pacific in World War II in a big way, these were division and corps size operations, tens of thousands of troops moving around. And that was kind of the basic unit of organization. You move to the second historical period you mentioned, Iraq and Afghanistan. The battalion was about 600, 900 folks. The battalion was the kind of a unit of I shouldn't say unit of analysis. It's very RAND-like of me. It's the kind of basic unit that the Marine Corps moves around in. And I think here for Force Design 2030, when they think about employing themselves in what they call expeditionary advanced base operations, these are going to be much smaller. So company minus, so that about 200 folks. Platoon size 40 folks, even squad reinforced size, so about 13 to 26 Marines in one place. And I think what's really interesting to me, and what really stuck out at me when I first read about it as a former infantry officer, was that they would be so far away from each other that they will not be able to mutually support one another directly in the ways that kind of traditional infantry Marines like myself would envision. And so that to me is the most distinctive part about this particular force design. And I got to say, this isn't something that the Marine Corps is alone in doing. The Army is thinking about chopping itself up into smaller and smaller pieces. The Air Force, same thing in terms of its agile combat employment concept. So all these efforts really focus on China to solve the targeting problem, or to at least mitigate some of the targeting problems that they think they'll see by disaggregating themselves into smaller and smaller units. So if you had to ask me, as you did, what's the kind of distinctive feature, I would point to that it's going to be just a couple Marines out there really alone and unafraid, connected differently to different capabilities, but not in the same kind of line of sight, kind of mutually supporting fashion that I would be familiar and comfortable with. I shouldn't say that not as a critique, but definitely there's a level of discomfort that I feel as a former Marine infantry officer, thinking about how they're going to be putting all these forces out there in such disparate places.
Well, man, I knew this would be a rich analogy to mine. I didn't quite realize how many different things we could draw on. But no matter how lonely you may have gotten in your foxhole, I assure you that doesn't in any way compare to whipping along at 18,000 miles an hour in low Earth orbit. Up in space, those space operations are really lonely, not least of which the severe distance between the operator in a ground control station and the spacecraft in space doing these things. So absolutely, from a space enterprise perspective, it definitely looks like the rest of the military moving more toward the model space has been working on for a long time.
I see what you did there. That's so interesting. I can even draw comparisons to kind of commercial space efforts where you have a lot of low Earth orbit kind of CubeSats and smaller satellites in much greater numbers and kind of spread around in different orbits. That's I'm gonna have to chew on that one. I might be thinking about this all day long. Maybe I'll text you later.
I'm very much looking forward to that conversation, although you're complicated a little bit, right? Because the more you turn into these, the more numbers you have, the harder it is to make it a single cohesive whole. One of the reasons the Space Force force design is such a powerful concept is because it is still a limited number. Or we can drive this point home even more. The Marine Corps, the smallest service until the Space Force arrived, right? The Army likes to be up around 500,000. The Air Force and Navy are well over 300,000. The Marines got close to being 200,000. Well, Space Force is going to increase their end strength by more than 30% this year to 8,400. So it's on a totally different scale. Now, different scale, again, for warfighting effects, it is not just what those people on the ground are doing, what those guardians on the ground are doing, but how you leverage today's informationized war, to steal the Chinese's term. That scale is really interesting, and I think the space people will take heart that other services are trying to move in that direction.
Yeah, I think definitely all the services are grappling with this, and I'd be really interested in having. I know very few guardians. Myself personally, I'd be really interested to pick their brains a little bit about how they feel about that. Because when I look at some of the work that I do for the Army investigating their intended operational concepts, and they haven't gone the same route with the kind of level of extreme kind of force design as the Marine Corps has, I do sense, at least from my interactions with soldiers, I do sense a level of discomfort about getting away from the brigade combat team and going into these smaller, more task organized units. And I wonder how the Navy feels about it as well, as it considers smaller ships where command opportunities are going to be more prevalent for more junior officers and even petty officers. I wonder what that does to these organizations that are used to the kind of the level of comfort that they have in the unit sizes that they have. From my conversations with other Marines, friends of mine that have stayed in, I don't see that level of discomfort too much. But I'd be really curious to see how the Space Force feels, because from what I understand, and Russell, correct me if I'm wrong, the Guardians come from somewhere. They come from the Air Force for the most part. I do believe also you've got a couple folks coming in from the other services, but they themselves come in with some sort of institutional memory, even if it's not the Space Force itself. And so I'm kind of curious about that.
Not quite anymore. The Space Force has started direct accessing, either commissioning straight out of the Air Force Academy or enlisting straight off the streets into the Space Force. So while it's still not the bulk of Space Force is well on its way to being its own service. And I also emphasize another word for small, John, is elite. Don't worry. We recognize you're still a little bit in the backwaters, but somehow we'll arrange to drive you across LA so you can come down to now the Los Angeles Space Garrison to meet some real Guardians. Or even better, we can drive you up the coast to the Vandenberg Space Base where you can see some of the operations in action as well.
I definitely want to take you up on that offer either way. The last time I was at LA Air Force Base, it was just an Air Force base. So I'm interested to see what life looks like now that it's part of the Space Force. But I think the question, it's going to be a really interesting question about how the organization forms culturally. And you can kind of, even from an outsider, I can kind of see elements of that. If you watch a recruiting commercial or look at their strategic documents, I can kind of see the outlines of the kind of culture, the organizational culture they're gonna cultivate. But yeah, I think it'll be really interesting, and I will definitely take you up on that offer. I just love, one of the reasons I love working at RAND is because I get to talk to people. I get to talk to people and ask them questions that feed my curiosity. So I am intensely curious about how that organizational culture in the Space Force is going to form or is forming.
Well, we certainly could spend a lot of time talking about how cool everything the Guardians do is, but we better go back to our expertise. And I want to go back to another analogy you had drawn out. You had talked about the iteration and the experimentation inherent in General Berger's vision. I'm curious to poke at that a little bit. Space Force is going even farther than that, right? It is not just experimentation, and nor is it just occasional iteration. Force design is baked into how they plan on doing everything, including even the annual budgeting cycle, right? That force design will be revisited as part of that and then be pervasive throughout all of the other decisions that get made about Space Force. Is that the same level of iteration General Berger means?
Not being in the rooms where these conversations are being had, I'm only reading the tea leaves from the outside. I think he means that. That is the ambition that he has. But the way you describe the Space Force's approach, if all else being equal, I think that the Space Force will have kind of great, further iteration cycles, more frequent iteration cycles in the Marine Corps. And the reason why I think that is this: to create this force design and to emphasize the things that he is changing. General Berger has had to really kind of poke at some sacred cows that the Marine Corps has. Whether that is the number of amphibious ships that the Marine Corps has always advocated for, he's come back from that a little bit. Whether it is disbanding Marine Armor, a small community, but still felt very it's. When they rolled up those unit flags, it was felt throughout the Marine Corps in a very severe way.
You're probably going to tell us a little more about what Marine Armor is.
Right. So those are Marine tanks. So the same tanks, actually, kind of lesser, not as sophisticated versions of the M1 tank, that Abrams tank, the main battle tank that the Army has. The Marine Corps had its own version. It was not as sophisticated, and General Berger saw that it was just eating up an inordinate amount of resources. No, they can't swim. Thank you, Russell. You're pointing me towards the other corner of Marine Armor, which is amphibious vehicles, armored amphibious vehicles that are very old, and that is actually being brought into question as to their future role. I did mention kind of early 2010s, the Marine Corps tried resetting itself back to an amphibious force. If that's not the answer, I wonder what the future of those amphibious vehicles are. So circling back, taking away things like that, like Marine Armor, is a signal that I think General Berger made deliberately to show just how serious he was about reinventing the Marine Corps. And what I worry about a lot for these force design efforts is that eventually he's going to run out, or I shouldn't say he, in that it's all personally in General Berger, but the Marine Corps may run out of institutional kind of energy to continue to iterate, because it has the weight of history on its back, I think, in a way that the Space Force doesn't. And the way you just described how the Space Force is going to be constantly iterating, almost like in an engineering fashion, right? Like software is never done. I'd be really curious to see if that gets baked into the organizational culture, where it is normal to really look at yourself and reinvent yourself and do a 2.0, 3.0, and keep developing different iterations of yourself at a very rapid clip. I think the Marine Corps is done a lot more than I thought it would. in terms of how many iterations it's gone through. The way I described, amphibious operations, crisis response. No, that wasn't it. All right, we're going to do this very drastic force design 2030. I wonder if they have enough energy, institutional energy, to keep doing it over and over again. So if I had, all else being equal, I can see the Space Force doing it more frequently. I see the Marine Corps, having maybe one more iteration in its gas tank that's left. But I'm definitely curious to see how that will all play out for both services.
And now you've pulled us back into our research interests, our common shared research interests, a great deal. You made the analogy to software development and the just constant iteration, right? The using agile processes, doing DevOps to keep that iteration. Of course, one of the reasons you can do it is you're just flipping those bits and bytes, right? You have very little physical infrastructure you need to change. But that's not true in defense decision making. You have a crap ton of infrastructure, not just all those tanks that the Marines now need to get rid of, but the decision making infrastructure, the Pentagon itself, to use the term, with all of its processes. We've mentioned General Berger, we've mentioned General Raymond, but of course, they're not the only actors in U.S. defense. There's a bunch of things that exist: the PPBE cycle, the acquisition cycle, the congressional budgeting cycle, OMB's review. There are all of these bureaucratic processes that these services have to fit their processes into. And I completely acknowledge it adds layers, although, as always, I have to give the defense that, we really shouldn't be concerned about living in a pluralist society, having a government that represents a bunch of different interests, right? I mean, that is what makes us America, and that is how we beat the Soviets. They had nice, clear lines. We didn't. I don't want to go back. But it's a challenge when you try to create these new things, like force design, when you try to do that iteration, because you have to do it in a process that may or may not be responsive to it. Can we peak? The Marines are a couple of years ahead, right? General Berger first unveiled this, 18 months ago?
Yeah, that's about right.
Have we seen it run into the Pentagon processes or congressional processes in a way we can start taking some lessons from?
A little bit in that I think there was, what was it? I absolutely take your point that the services do not kind of walk alone. They're integrated into a larger bureaucracy, the largest bureaucracy in the world, and they have to contend with that. Before I answer, though, I will observe that we are talking about the two small services. So if there's anyone that can do it within the constraints I'm going to talk about, it's the 8,000 person strong Space Force. It is the 186,000 person Marine Corps, the two smaller services that have, I think, the greatest ability to make these changes because they are, in relative terms, smaller than the rest. But you're right, there are a lot of impediments to that. Have the Marines run into resistance internally? They did, but I think in a way that has been productive. Critiques that run across. Whether it's articles in the Marine Corps Gazette or internal conversations within headquarters Marine Corps, I think a lot of those have been addressed effectively by the Commandant, addressed effectively by his staff, and institutionally, the Marine Corps is presenting a pretty united front about where it wants to go. Now, I would say that in terms of how it runs into the DoD process, I don't see too many impediments there. Where I did see some resistance or some obstacles, I shouldn't say resistance, definitely some obstacles, is when they came across their budget request. And I believe that they had requested, I forget the exact amount, a significant amount of money for land-based long-range precision fires. Congress pared that request back a little bit. I have not yet seen the response, kind of responses emerging from the latest budget request. I have not seen that same reluctance to invest in precision fires remains. But I remember reading about that, 6-8 months ago, I was very surprised, and it seemed to me that the Marine Corps did not make a clear enough case for why it needs ground-based long-range precision fires and that kind of investment. If I had to answer, from looking at the entirety of its force design efforts, I haven't seen not that much resistance, which is a little surprising. But I'm also in kind of a wait and see mode. They've only made the kind of they made a couple high profile cuts, cutting those armor units like I talked about, but they haven't really. The Marine Corps hasn't really dove in, and really started breaking the China. No pun intended, breaking the China to get what it wants. It's not quite there yet. So I think whether it'll run into serious resistance, I think remains to be seen. I wish I had a better answer in terms of lessons for the Space Force, though.
What if we turn the question a little bit different and talk about the Marines' own bureaucracy? Again, we can first draw some neat parallels, right? The rest of the services have embraced the general staff system, right? G1, G4, G8, N1, N4, N8. The Air Force, A1, A4, A8. The Marines never went that way. They always had program and resources, policy, plan, and operations. The Space Force is following along that line. They're using, as it were, corporate titles. The Chief Strategy and Resources Officer, the Chief Operations Officer, the Chief Human Capital Officer. Now, partly that's because there's just fewer 3-star direct reports to the Chief of Space Operations than there are in the other services. That's true of the Marines as well. How much have we seen the Marines' processes change to better make force design happen?
Sure, there was definitely, and this is only what I've observed from the outside. There was definitely a large reorganization of what's called the advocate structure, or advocate system within the Marine Corps. Previously, the Marine Corps had various occupational fields: infantry, armor, artillery, logistics, so on and so forth. All those had what was called an advocate that pushed for the priorities, whether it's material or personnel or whatnot, that pushed for that community's needs within the Marine Corps. There was a huge restructuring of that advocate system because it was, I think the commandant correctly saw that was where most of the resistance was going to come from. So he preempted that by restructuring the advocate organization to allow it to think more freely, to not be so fixated on fighting for the existing programs and priorities that it wanted before. And he was remarkably effective, I think, in doing it. And that is, as a disclaimer, this is me watching that happen from the outside. But it was really interesting to see that bureaucratic reshuffling take place, almost like preparatory fires, where he was able to kind of address some of the internal bureaucratic obstacles that he foresaw would take place. So that was definitely an interesting thing to watch.
John, that was very illuminating, not least because of this concept of advocates. Space Force I don't think anybody in the Space Force would know how to use the word advocate. This is one of the dynamics of going from being a minor community in a larger service to having their own service, the Space Force being a service by itself dedicated to the space domain. We certainly have organizational structure, right? Not least of which the major field commands, the systems command, acquisition for the most part, the operations command, training and readiness command. But I don't think folks see themselves as advocates for that. It's not that the command represents a stovepipe or anything. Of course, that may drive home even more the importance of the SWAC, the Space Warfighting Analysis Center, which is neither a field command, nor is it staff. It is a different kind of thing, a different animal, a direct reporting unit with that task to think more holistically. I guess, is there something more than the commandant himself who's serving that role in the Marine Corps?
Yeah, that's a great question, Russell. Is there kind of an institutional home for this kind of innovation or force design? I don't think in the same way that the Space Force has arranged itself. And maybe this points to the role of analysis in the different services. I got to make a shout out to former Randi Carl Bilder, who wrote about that in, I think, the mid-'80s in Masks of War, about how the different services use analysis and studies and things like that. For the Marine Corps, I think it's a very organic community. Is there a central home for force design? I can't identify one, but I can identify an emerging group or cadre of midfield grade officers and staff NCOs that are very invested in these ideas and are willing to push the envelope and are willing to experiment alongside others on this. But I don't see the same centralized role that the Space Warfare Analysis Center might play for the Space Force. No.
Well, that's an interesting difference. We'll have to watch in the coming years. What does it matter? Do you have a key element focused on that, or is it somehow infused throughout? Although, since you used the word organic, I'm going to take advantage of that to analogize to what I think is the last time the Marines tried something this radical. And not surprisingly, it's the last time they came out of a big war that wasn't what they thought was their bread and butter. Coming out of Vietnam, with all of the country trying to focus on the Central Front, the European theater staring down the Soviets who are trying to improve their qualitative superiority, or trying to improve their quality so they are not so qualitatively inferior to what the United States had achieved. And this is totally stealing from Terry Tariff, but he points out there was a debate: do we go big, get more armored like the Army, or do we go small? What's interesting about this debate is maybe we've already seen that in the past you heard, but I can't help but notice that the Marines ended up looking a lot like what they went into in before Vietnam, but they did end up as a middleweight force. Is that just institutional pressures? Is that bureaucratic pressures? Is it operational pressures? And what can that tell us as we look at these organizations trying to more consciously design themselves for the future?
Maybe they should have signaled by using the word force design, or the term force design, to get a little bit more extreme. No, I think the answer to that is actually that maybe what they figured out was that what they were the force design that they had at the time was actually sufficient to do the trick. And I think where a lot of the intellectual energy seemed to go was how those forces were employed. And this is the whole early 80s debate in the Marine Corps about maneuver warfare and these kind of German concepts and things like that. And I got to say, today, the Marine Corps, particularly in these field grade officers that I'm seeing, they look back to that time as a time of inspiration. They look back to the captains and majors and lieutenant colonels that were pushing for maneuver warfare and having these knockdown intellectual arguments, and they see themselves as inheritors to that and want to pattern themselves after the intellectual kind of back and forth that happened in the early 80s in the Marine Corps regarding maneuver warfare. So I definitely see the through line there, and I think you raise a great point that the Marine Corps has been here before in the post-Vietnam time. I think the approach that they're taking now is probably more drastic than that, because I think they've come to realize over the last 10 years that they have to take these more extreme measures in terms of force design, because the amphibious return to amphibious roots idea really didn't work. The crisis response emphasis wasn't sufficient. It really required a more extreme review and kind of relook.
Well, I'm really enjoying how many of these analogies we keep turning up, because the 80s were a very important time for the space community too. The establishment of Air Force Space Command and the start of the consolidation of space within the Air Force is absolutely one of the forerunners to Space Force being its own military service today. Again, in yet new operational circumstances, new strategic circumstances. I'm not quite brave enough to tell you what the next war is going to look like, but we've also had a great conversation already. So can I just ask you any final thoughts? Are there analogies you think are important? Are there lessons to be learned? What should we in the space community be thinking about having from somebody who's watched the Marine Corps go through this reorganization or this conscious effort to reorganize?
If there's one thing that I would take away if I was an observer from the Space Force, is having an eye towards implementation. And implementation thinking, what I mean by that is thinking about how being conscious about how your organization is forming culturally. Because when you described the kind of staff system the other services have, but the Marine Corps and the Space Force doesn't, it got me to thinking about, why is that? Why is the Space Force going in this particular direction, and what are the implications of that for how it makes decisions? I don't critique it one way or another, but I think being conscious of the organization that you're forming and the way and what it emphasizes is particularly important. Secondarily, I think implementation in terms of how it fits into the overall defense, the defense acquisition system, the PPB structure, JCIDs, et cetera, I think is particularly important. I think there's a role for that, and I think it's a particularly good time to be thinking about now, because I think there's a lot of momentum in the institution and in Congress as well towards having a second look at those structures. I think they've made a lot of progress on the defense acquisition system and kind of breaking that up into more digestible chunks. I think the next thing that the Space Force should be conscious of is how the PPBE system, the resourcing system, and the requirement system, JCIDs, is going to change in the future, and having an eye and leaning in and making making sure its needs are represented as those changes occur, because I think they're going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years.
Well, I certainly enjoy getting to think about those challenges, although nothing like concluding a space policy show with the sister FFRDC emphasizing we get the luxury of thinking about them without getting stuck with the responsibility for actually doing it. So we get to sit in a pretty catbird seat. And this show has emphasized that to me. John, I learned a ton from you. I thought there was something here, but actually having the conversation and seeing the analogies, getting to tease out the differences where we found them, it's been very interesting to me. I hope you've enjoyed becoming just a little bit spacier. It is the 21st century, John. And look forward to many conversations to come as we explore all these ideas.
Thanks for having me, Russell. If there's anyone that can figure out the through line between the Marine Corps and the Space Force, it's you. So thank you very much for having me.
I don't know if I'll live up to that, but Rebecca, thank you for letting us have this conversation, and we hope it's of interest to others as well. Cheers, everybody.
Thank you to Russell and Jonathan for that interesting discussion. Thanks to our spectacular production team, Colleen Stover, James Liggins, and Jordan Bingham. Check us out on Twitter using #TheSpacePolicyShow, and sign up for our latest news and alerts at aerospace.org/policy. Be sure to look for our podcasts and share your favorite episodes with colleagues. We look forward to having you tune into our next episode of the Space Policy Show. And until then, take care.